Imagine opening a map of the world. Something immediately feels wrong. There is no Nigeria, no Kenya, no Democratic Republic of the Congo, no borders drawn with straight lines across the continent. In fact, almost every African country you know today looks completely different. Why? Because in this world, Europe never colonized Africa. No Berlin Conference, no Scramble for Africa, no European empires dividing the continent among themselves. At first, that might sound like a much better world, but would it really be that simple? Would Africa be the richest continent on Earth? Would today's African kingdoms have become global superpowers? Or would the continent have faced completely different challenges? The truth is, history doesn't work like a movie. Change just one event, and everything else begins to change with it. To understand what Africa might look like without colonization, we first have to understand what Africa looked like before it. And the answer might surprise you. Long before European powers divided the continent, Africa was home to powerful kingdoms, thriving trade networks, and some of the world's greatest centers of learning. The Mali Empire became famous for its immense wealth. The Kingdom of Benin built impressive cities and produced remarkable bronze artworks that are still admired today. The Kingdom of Kongo traded with European merchants as an organized state long before colonial rule began. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia remains one of the world's oldest independent civilizations. Across the continent, societies developed in different ways. Some built large kingdoms, others formed city-states, others governed through village councils and local traditions. Africa was never one single civilization. It was hundreds of different societies, each with its own language, culture, and way of life. Then, in the late 19th century, everything changed. Or did it? What if that moment never came? Because if Europe never colonized Africa, the story of the modern world might look nothing like the one we know today. Let's imagine that the scramble for Africa never happened. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 never divided the continent. European empires never carved Africa into colonies, and African rulers continued making their own decisions about their lands. So, what happens next? The first thing that changes is the map. The borders we know today would almost certainly never exist. Countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, Zambia, and Sudan were created by colonial boundaries, not by African kingdoms or ethnic groups. Without colonization, the continent would likely remain a patchwork of independent kingdoms, city-states, federations, and growing nations, each following its own path. Some states might join together through trade or diplomacy. Others might compete for power, just like countries in Europe and Asia did. History suggests that political change would still happen, but it would be driven far more by African leaders than by European governments. Now think about trade. Before colonial rule expanded across the continent, Africa was already connected to global commerce. Gold from West Africa traveled across the Sahara. Ivory, salt, cloth, and iron moved through regional trade routes. Along the East African coast, merchants exchanged goods with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China through the Indian Ocean. Without colonial rule, these trade networks might have expanded even further. African ports could have become some of the busiest commercial centers in the world, connecting continents on African terms. But that doesn't automatically mean every kingdom would become rich. Some states would likely prosper because of their location, natural resources, or strong leadership. Others might struggle with drought, conflict, or poor governance. Just like every other continent, Africa would still have winners and losers. And that brings us to another important question. Would African kingdoms have remained separate forever? Or would some of them have grown into powerful modern nations capable of competing with Britain, France, or Japan? The answer may lie in the remarkable empires that already existed long before European colonization, and some of them were far more advanced than many people realize. Imagine walking through the city of Benin in the 1400s. Wide streets stretch into the distance. Towering walls surround the city. Skilled craftsmen create breathtaking bronze sculptures so detailed that centuries later, they still amaze historians and museum visitors around the world. Now ask yourself, what if this kingdom had been allowed to keep growing for another 500 years? Or imagine standing in the Mali Empire, where caravans loaded with gold crossed the Sahara Desert. When Emperor Mansa Musa traveled to Mecca in 1324, he carried so much gold that historians say his journey affected the Valley of Gold in parts of the Middle East. His empire became known as one of the wealthiest in history. What if that wealth had continued to fuel universities, roads, industries, and new technologies, instead of being disrupted by changing trade routes and later colonial expansion? Then there was the Kingdom of Kongo. Long before most of Africa was colonized, Congo had a king, a structured government, diplomats, and trade relations with Portugal. It wasn't an isolated society, it was already engaging with the wider world. And in the northeast, Ethiopia followed a different path. It remained independent through most of the colonial era, and even defeated an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, proving that European expansion was not unstoppable. These examples reveal something important. Africa was never an empty continent waiting to be developed. It already had governments. It already had engineers, traders, scholars, artists, and military leaders. Would every kingdom have become a global power? Probably not. History doesn't guarantee success. Some kingdoms might have collapsed because of internal conflict. Others could have been overtaken by stronger neighbors. Some may have struggled to industrialize, just as many countries outside Africa did. But others might have modernized, built industries, expanded education, and transformed into powerful nations on their own terms. Perhaps instead of dozens of colonial territories becoming independent in the 1960s, the world would recognize a handful of large African powers, with borders shaped by centuries of African history rather than decisions made in European capitals. And if that had happened, the balance of global power might look completely different today. But there is one more question that could change everything. If Europe had never colonized Africa, would Europe itself have become as powerful as it is today? That answer may be even more surprising than what happened to Africa. When people ask, what if Africa had never been colonized? They usually focus on Africa. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Maybe we should be asking, what would Europe and the rest of the world look like without Africa? For centuries, European empires gained enormous wealth from their colonies. Africa supplied valuable resources such as gold, diamonds, copper, rubber, cocoa, palm oil, and later oil. These resources helped fuel industries and supported the rapid growth of European economies. Without direct control over many of these resources, Europe's rise might have looked very different. That doesn't mean Europe would have remained poor. The Industrial Revolution had many causes, including scientific advances, new technologies, expanding trade, and political changes. But historians generally agree that colonial empires gave several European powers access to additional markets, labor, and raw materials that strengthened their economies. Now imagine an Africa that remains politically independent while continuing to trade with Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Instead of exporting mostly raw materials under colonial systems, African nations might have processed more of those resources themselves. Imagine factories refining copper, steel mills producing machinery, universities training engineers, African-owned shipping companies carrying goods around the world. Instead of being known mainly as suppliers of raw materials, some African countries might have become major manufacturing and financial centers. Would every nation have succeeded? Of course not. Every continent has faced wars, economic crises, and political struggles. Africa would almost certainly have experienced its own challenges. But those challenges might have been shaped far more by African decisions than by colonial administrations. And there's another consequence many people overlook. Without colonial borders, many of today's ethnic and political tensions might have developed differently. Some conflicts may never have happened. Others might still have occurred for entirely different reasons. History rarely removes conflict, it simply changes its causes. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. If Africa had never been colonized, would it truly be richer today? The answer isn't as simple as yes or no. And that's what makes this question so fascinating, because history doesn't deal in certainty, it deals in possibilities. The final piece of the puzzle is understanding what we can reasonably conclude and what we can never know for sure.
So, what if Africa had never been colonized? Would the continent be richer? Perhaps. Would some of today's conflicts have been avoided? Possibly. Would Africa have become home to several global superpowers? It certainly wasn't impossible. History shows that many African kingdoms were already building powerful states, expanding trade, developing sophisticated governments, and connecting with the wider world long before the colonial era. Without foreign rule, some of those societies may have continued to evolve into strong modern nations on their own terms. But history also teaches us something equally important. Colonization was not the only force that shaped Africa. Like every continent, Africa faced internal rivalries, changing trade routes, environmental challenges, disease, political struggles, and competition between neighboring states. Those challenges would not have disappeared simply because Europe stayed away. The future would still have depended on leadership, innovation, cooperation, education, and the choices made by African societies themselves. Perhaps the biggest difference is this. African nations would have had the opportunity to make those choices without colonial governments deciding their borders, controlling their economies, or ruling their people. And maybe that freedom to shape their own future would have changed everything. Or maybe it would have created a completely different set of challenges that we cannot fully predict. Because history doesn't give us two versions of the world to compare. It gives us only one. What we do know is that Africa's story did not begin with colonization. For thousands of years before European empires arrived, the continent was home to great civilizations, thriving cities, remarkable trade networks, brilliant scholars, and powerful kingdoms. That history deserves to be remembered. Not because it tells us what would have happened, but because it reminds us what was possible. Today, Africa is home to the world's youngest population, some of the fastest growing cities, and enormous natural and human potential. The future of the continent will not be written by events that happened over a century ago alone. It will be written by the decisions made today, and by the generations still to come. So perhaps the better question isn't, what if Africa had never been colonized? Perhaps the more important question is, what kind of Africa will be built from this moment forward? The answer to that question has not been written yet. What do you think? If Africa had never been colonized, how different would the continent and the world be today? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's have a respectful discussion.